All right, so today we are diving headfirst into this concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2025,
Okay.
which basically lays out how the U.S. government plans to spend your tax dollars over the next decade.
Right.
It's quite the dense document, but we're here to break it down and help you understand what it all means for you.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the numbers.
Oh, yeah.
But this document really has some real-world implications. We're talking about everything from healthcare and education to defense and infrastructure.
Exactly. So let's start with the big picture.
Okay.
This resolution sets the budget for the upcoming fiscal year, and then it outlines targets for the following 9 years, all the way to 2034.
Wow.
And one of the most striking things that we noticed is the aim to reduce mandatory spending by a whopping $2 trillion over the next decade.
That's a huge number.
It's a massive number.
And it signals a pretty significant shift in priorities.
Yeah.
To put that in perspective, imagine the government had to tighten its belt like a family facing unexpected expenses.
Right.
What would they cut back on? What would they prioritize?
Yeah.
This resolution gives us some clues.
So now the question is, where's all that money coming from?
Right.
It seems like the resolution projects federal revenues to increase each year, ultimately reaching $5.4 trillion by 2034.
Yeah.
But there's also this recurring theme of reducing aggregate revenue levels by $450 billion annually.
Huh.
What's the thinking behind that?
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
It suggests an expectation of lower overall tax revenue.
Okay.
This could be due to various factors, like potential tax cuts or an anticipated decrease in certain revenue streams.
Got it.
We'll need to dig deeper into the specifics to get a clearer understanding of their assumptions.
Okay, so we've got this big goal of reducing spending, but the government still needs to fund essential services. So let's dive into how they're planning to allocate those trillions of dollars.
Absolutely. Let's start with one of the biggest slices of the pie,
Okay.
national defense.
Okay.
The budget projects this category to exceed $1 trillion by 2034.
Wow, that's more than double what it is today.
It is.
What kind of message does that send, both domestically and internationally? Does this signal a more assertive foreign policy or a response to escalating global threats?
That's a question worth pondering.
Yeah.
This level of spending could reflect a number of factors, including the current geopolitical climate advancements in military technology and perceived national security priorities.
Next up is healthcare, another area that consistently demands a significant portion of the budget.
Absolutely. Healthcare spending is a major concern, and this resolution highlights that Medicare alone is projected to reach $1.6 trillion in spending by 2034.
That's a staggering figure. It makes you wonder what's driving this trend. Is
Yeah.
it simply an aging population, or are rising healthcare costs also playing a major role?
It's likely a combination of both. We're seeing an increase in the number of people eligible for Medicare, coupled with rising costs for medical services and prescription drugs.
And then there's the issue of net interest,
Right.
which is basically the cost of borrowing money to cover all this spending.
Yeah. And get this, it's projected to skyrocket to $1.6 trillion by 2034.
Wow.
That's a huge chunk of our budget just going towards interest payments.
It's a bit like carrying a massive credit card balance.
Right.
The more debt we accumulate, the more we end up paying in interest, leaving less money available for other important things.
Right.
This raises some serious questions about the long-term sustainability of our current fiscal path.
Yeah, it really puts things in perspective when you think about how those interest payments could be used to fund other priorities like education or infrastructure.
Absolutely. It highlights the opportunity cost of our national debt. But before we spiral into despair, let's look at some other spending categories. We see transportation, education, veterans, benefits all getting their share of the budget pie. But there was one line item that really caught my eye. Commerce and housing credit. It actually shows negative outlays in some years. What's the deal with that?
Yeah, negative outlays, that sounds almost counterintuitive when we're talking about government spending.
It does seem odd at first glance.
Yeah, negative outlays could mean a couple of things. It could be that loan repayments are exceeding new loans being issued in those years, or it could indicate that revenue generated from specific programs within that category is offsetting spending. It definitely warrants a closer look.
Okay, so we've got a sense of where the money is supposed to be coming from and where it's going. But how does Congress actually make those numbers a reality?
That's where the process of reconciliation comes in.
Okay.
It's basically a way for Congress to bridge the gap between its budgetary goals and existing laws.
So it's not as simple as just setting a budget and calling it a day.
Not quite. Think of it like this Congress sets a budget, but then they have to figure out how to actually implement it. That often means making changes to existing laws that govern spending, and revenue reconciliation provides a framework for doing that.
Okay, so walk me through how that works in practice.
Different House committees are assigned specific tasks related to achieving those budgetary targets. Some committees are tasked with finding ways to reduce the deficit, while others have more leeway to potentially increase spending in certain areas.
So it's kind of like a giant puzzle where each committee has to find its piece.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
some pieces are definitely bigger and more challenging than others. For example, the Ways and Means Committee, which deals with taxes and revenue, has the biggest task. They're charged with finding a whopping $4.5 trillion in deficit reduction.
That's more than the entire economies of many countries.
Yeah.
What about the other committees? What are some of their key tasks?
Well, for example, the Agriculture Committee is looking at $230 billion in deficit reduction. Meanwhile, the Education and Workforce Committee is aiming for $330 billion, and the Energy and Commerce Committee has a particularly daunting challenge targeting $880 billion in reductions.
Wow. So each committee has its own set of challenges and priorities, but it's not just about number crunching, right? I noticed the resolution also includes these policy statements. What role do those play?
Those policy statements are really important. They offer insights into the underlying philosophy and goals driving the budget. It's not just about the numbers, it's about the broader vision.
So what are some of the key themes or principles that stand out in these policy statements?
There's a strong emphasis on economic growth, particularly through free market principles. The resolution advocates for reduced spending, expanded energy production, lower taxes, and deregulation.
It sounds like this budget resolution is reflecting a particular set of economic beliefs. Would you say this leans towards a more conservative approach to fiscal policy?
You could definitely make that argument. The emphasis on reducing government intervention in the economy and fostering private sector growth aligns with core principles often associated with conservative economic thought.
Okay, so we've talked about reducing spending, but the elephant in the room is the national debt. The resolution acknowledges this, right?
Absolutely. It explicitly calls for tackling the national debt through reduced spending and responsible fiscal management.
Makes sense. It's hard to ignore a $36 trillion debt. Anything else in those policy statements that jumps out at you?
There's a significant focus on government deregulation. The resolution criticizes the ballooning code of federal regulations, which has grown exponentially over the decades.
Wait, how big is this code of federal regulations? Give me some context.
It's mind-boggling. Back in 1960, it was a relatively slim 22,877 pages. Today, it's nearly 200,000 pages.
That's an insane amount of regulations. It sounds like this resolution is trying to rein in the size and scope of government.
That's one way to interpret it. The resolution definitely advocates for reducing regulatory burdens and streamlining government processes.
So it's not just about spending less, but also potentially changing how the government operates. What about Congress's role in all of this? Does the resolution address that at all?
It does. It specifically mentions the REINS Act, which stands for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny.
Okay.
This piece of legislation aims to give Congress more control over major regulations proposed by the executive branch.
Interesting. So the resolution seems to be pushing for a shift in power dynamics, giving Congress a greater say in the regulatory process.
That's a key takeaway. It suggests a desire to reassert congressional authority over the regulatory landscape. Now, there's one last piece of this budget puzzle we need to address: the reserve fund and deficit reduction adjustment.
Okay, what are those all about?
Think of them as safety nets built into the budget process.
Okay.
They allow for adjustments to accommodate the budgetary effects of any new legislation that might come along.
So if Congress passes a law that impacts spending or revenue, they can tweak the budget accordingly.
Exactly. But there's a catch. There's a specific trigger built into the resolution if those committees we talked about earlier fail to achieve at least $2 trillion in deficit reduction.
Oh, that sounds ominous. What happens then?
Well, the Ways and Means Committee, which already has the toughest job, gets an even bigger hurdle to clear their task, gets adjusted, and they have to find even more savings to compensate.
Wow, that's a lot of pressure on one committee. It sounds like the resolution is trying to ensure that its deficit reduction goals are met, even if some committees fall short.
It's a way of building in accountability and ensuring that the overall budgetary targets are achieved one way or another.
It seems like this budget resolution is laying out a pretty ambitious roadmap for the next decade. What does all this mean for the average person listening right now?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's hard to say with certainty how these proposals will play out in the real world, but we can make some educated guesses. For example, The emphasis on deregulation could have a ripple effect across various industries.
So which industries might feel the biggest impact?
While sectors like energy finance and healthcare, which are often subject to extensive regulations, could see a noticeable shift, reduced regulatory burdens, could potentially lead to increased investment and economic activity in those areas.
But couldn't there be some downsides to deregulation as well?
Absolutely. It's important to consider the potential trade-offs. While deregulation can stimulate economic growth, it can also raise concerns about consumer protection, environmental standards, and worker safety.
It sounds like there's a delicate balance to strike between fostering economic growth and safeguarding other important societal values.
Exactly. It's crucial to weigh the potential benefits against the potential risks and to consider the long-term consequences of these policy choices.
Looking back at everything we've covered, what's your biggest takeaway from this deep dive into the budget resolution?
For me, it's a stark reality of the national debt, and the difficult choices it presents. This resolution represents a clear attempt to address that challenge, but it remains to be seen how these proposals will be received and implemented.
That's a really important point. And it's a reminder that this document is just the beginning of a long and complex process. It sets the stage for a lot of debate and negotiation in the months ahead.
Exactly. The budget process is rarely straightforward. It involves compromise, competing priorities, and a whole lot of political maneuvering.
Well, we've certainly given our listeners a lot to think about today. What are some key things you'd like them to keep in mind as they follow this budget debate moving forward?
I'd encourage everyone to stay informed, engage with their elected officials, and think critically about the information they encounter. Remember, the budget isn't just a bunch of numbers. It reflects our values and priorities as a nation.
Beautifully said. It's a reminder that we all have a stake in this conversation.
Absolutely. The choices we make today will have a lasting impact on our future. So stay curious, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.
That's a perfect note to end on. Until next time, happy deep diving.